Hello everybody, I'm going to show you the parts of the upper respiratory tract. So this is the external nose and this is the nasal cavity. This is a longitudinal section of the head. So this is half head. So you can see one half of the nasal cavity, and the area just around the nostril is this opening of nose, and just around the nostril this area is called the vestibule. Okay, so vestibule is here, and then inside the nasal cavity you can see here three concha: superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and inferior nasal concha. And concha are shelf-like projections from the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So you have similar concha in the other side of the nasal cavity, and the concha are separated by these folds. These are called meatus. So superior meatus, middle meatus, inferior nasal meatus. Okay, so three concha and three meatuses. And then around the nasal cavity you have the sinuses. This is called the frontal sinus in the frontal bone. This is sphenoidal sinus. Sinuses improve the quality of the sound. Okay, so that's why they are located around the nasal cavity inside the bones. Okay, then this part behind or posterior to the nasal cavity is the nasopharynx. So this is the nasopharynx, and this opening is for the auditory tube. So one end of the auditory tube is in the nasopharynx. So this is the opening of the auditory tube. The other end goes to the middle ear. So the auditory tube, which is also called pharyngotympanic tube or eustachian tube. So auditory or pharyngotympanic or eustachian tube connects the nasopharynx to the middle ear, and this auditory tube maintains the equilibrium of pressure inside the nose and inside the ear. Then you have this structure attached to the posterior wall of the nasopharynx. This is called the pharyngeal tonsil. So pharyngeal tonsil is also called adenoid. Adenoidectomy is the removal of the pharyngeal tonsil. And in tonsillitis, if that creates problem like pain and swelling of that, in that case sometimes we remove this pharyngeal tonsil surgically, and that is called adenoidectomy. This is the roof of the nasal cavity, and this is the floor of the nasal cavity. Okay, so the roof is formed by the sphenoid bone posteriorly and the ethmoid bone anteriorly. So two bones form the roof of the nasal cavity, the ethmoid and sphenoid. And the floor of the nasal cavity is formed by the palate. This part is the bony part of the palate, is called the hard palate, and this part is the muscular part, is the soft palate. Okay, so this hard palate is formed by two bones. Anterior 2/3 is formed by the maxilla, and posterior 1/3 is formed by the palatine bone. palate, so palatine bone, and anterior part, 2/3 part is by the maxilla. Okay. The soft palate is formed by skeletal muscle, which is covered by a thick mucosa. So this is the skeletal muscle and this is the thick mucosa. Okay, and this end, free end of the soft palate is called the uvula. So when you swallow the food from the oral cavity, this is the oral cavity, food goes this way and the uvula moves up to close this passage. So the food cannot enter into the nasal cavity, food can only go downwards, okay, towards the esophagus. So uvula is very important to close this opening during the swallowing of the food. Now if you go down behind the oral cavity, this part is called the oropharynx. So nasopharynx, then next is the oropharynx, and last part is the laryngopharynx. So pharynx is from here to here and it has three parts: nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. And from the laryngopharynx, the food enters into the esophagus and air enters into the larynx. So when you swallow the food enters into the esophagus. So the inlet of larynx must be closed during the swallowing of the food, otherwise food will enter into the larynx, which could be dangerous. So this cartilaginous structure is called the epiglottis, formed by the elastic cartilage. Okay, and this one can move up and down. So when you swallow the food, the epiglottis moves down to close the laryngeal inlet, opening of the larynx. So food cannot enter into the larynx, food can only go into the esophagus. Okay. However, when you inhale or exhale air, this one must be open, so the air can get into the larynx and also can get out. Make sense? So only during swallowing of the food, the uvula will move up, so food cannot get into the nasal cavity, and the epiglottis should move down to close the laryngeal inlet or opening of the larynx. Okay, this is the vocal fold or vocal cord, and this is the larynx and this is the esophagus. Okay, and this opening of the larynx is called the glottis. Okay, and the epithelial lining of the nasal cavity and nasopharynx is pseudostratified ciliated columnar, because no food passes through this part, no friction, only air enters into the nasal cavity, then passes through the nasopharynx. Since the food enters into the oropharynx in this part, this is a common pathway for food and air, right? So the oropharynx and laryngopharynx both are common pathway for the food and air. So they are lined by stratified squamous epithelium. Why? Because food causes friction, and those areas gets friction are usually lined by stratified squamous epithelium. Only air lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Okay. So those are the structures you can see here, and now this is the largest laryngeal cartilage. This is called the thyroid cartilage. Okay, so thyroid cartilage forms the Adam's apple. Okay, and this bone is called the hyoid bone. Okay, so those are the structures you can see in this model.